it's great that these technologies don't necessarily recognize everybody and every identity, and some people are left out of their technological imaginary and scope of concern. I think we can also critique them for not being inclusive, and at the same time be worried about the people who are included. So I don't necessarily think it has to be one or the other. I think that what my book tries to offer is a way to bring attention and raise consciousness about the problems with technologies as solutions, while also not trying to argue that we shouldn't use technologies when we truly believe that they are the only modality of care possible.
Mm-hmm. You also volunteered as a listener in a sort of peer-to-peer mental health platform. Can you tell me a bit about that experience?
Yeah. So for a number of months off and on, I volunteered as what was called a listener, as you mentioned, on a platform called 7 Cups of Tea. 7 Cups of Tea is not the only platform and application that offers this service, but what it basically does is it trains normal people like you and me who don't have any background or knowledge about what constitutes mental health, mental illness, how to deal with persons in crises, and offers brief educational lessons about how to engage in empathetic and supportive communication and listening over a typed platform. So on 7 Cups of Tea, once you complete this training, and for me training was very brief, it only took me about 10 minutes to do, which I felt was woefully inadequate, you are able to volunteer as a listener, and you are basically put into a waiting room with others who, for whatever reason they so choose, want to communicate with a stranger because you don't know who anybody is who's volunteering or coming to talk to the listener. They want to just share what they're going through, and you are volunteering knowing that people are coming to the platform probably experiencing some level of mental distress. Nobody is turned away from 7 Cups of Tea and other platforms that offer similar services. So I did volunteer on this platform, and I did have many experiences with people who I perceived as experiencing acute mental distress, and I was not equipped to respond to it in the ways that I believe were needed. And the reason it's so distressing is that we are continually told in this training, but also culturally as a whole, that we can help each other when we see others experiencing mental distress. But the popularization of the tools and technologies that I talk about reinforces that idea that we can take individual responsibility for not only our own mental health, but also noticing what constitutes distress in others, when the truth is that it really takes dedicated time and training and information to be able to help others. But we are still being told that we can help. So on a platform like 7 Cups of Tea or other platforms, it can cause distress in the person offering their services. I reflect on that in the book. I say it was really difficult for me when I felt like I couldn't help others, or when I tried to encourage them to use paid-for services to connect with true mental health professionals, and they would say things like, well, thank you, but I actually can't afford to do that. So you as a listener become their only resource, and just feeling unable to help them is really distressing.
You're listening to Spark from your friends at CBC Radio.
I'm Nora Young, and today we're talking about the boom in mental health tech and the limits to tech fixes for mental health gaps. Right now, my guest is Emma Bedore-Hyland. She teaches in the College of Media and Communication at Texas Tech University. Designers of technologies for mental health, from chatbots to wellness apps, often talk about how they increase access to mental health services as a way to address the mental health care crisis. But in her new book, Therapy Tech, The Digital Transformation of Mental Health Care, Emma argues that access is a more complex phenomenon. The tools themselves often have flaws and assumptions that perpetuate discriminatory bias and reduce mental health to personal responsibilities. She says there's been a neoliberal move towards what she calls responsibilization.
So responsibilization theoretically draws upon the work of Michel Foucault and other cultural studies scholars who discuss the ways that as we see the rollback of the state, and I say state with a capital S, so the government, the state, to help us in ways that we're not necessarily equipped to help ourselves. Instead, we're encouraged to see ourselves as solutions to problems as they arise. So in the context of mental health technology, rather than think that there is going to be a wealth of mental health care professionals who we can easily access and pay for and work with when we need them, we're encouraged to see ourselves and the tools and technologies that are already at our fingertips, supposedly, that we can use those instead to help ourselves, rather than depend on external, especially government resources to help us. We are encouraged to help ourselves so as not to be a drag on the economy, especially mental distress and mental illness cost the global economy billions of dollars. So there really is an economic incentive for governments to encourage us to learn to care for ourselves effectively.
But don't you think people also appreciate taking control of their own mental well-being, that there's a sort of empowering aspect to that, especially in the context of a sometimes paternalistic medical system?
Yes, I think that's a really great counterpoint. One thing I do want to say, though, is that there's a significant difference between feeling empowered and having power. So if a technology makes you feel like you are able to assert control and autonomy in your life, and like you feel like it is benefiting you, that is great. But at the same time, if you lack the power and the resources to be able to seek out additional services, if you feel like they are necessary, or if a technology itself tells you that it algorithmically thinks that true mental health care services and interventions are necessary, then empowerment and power are two very different things. So I think it's important not to confuse the two when we think about what technology can offer and the false promises that it can make.
What do you think it means for our self-understanding when we use these tools? Does it change the way we think of ourselves, do you think?
You know, that's a really great question. One of the things that comes to my mind first is the work of a feminist scholar named Donna Haraway, and she writes about people as being cyborgs and the ways that we interact with and utilize technologies. And a lot of us, I think, due to the nature of how we use technologies and how we have our smartphones and our laptops and our screens always open and available to us pretty much every waking moment, our technologies are part of how we live our lives. So if we think about your question being, does it change how we think of self in relation to technologies? My concern would be if we become techno-reliant, that would be exclusively reliant upon technology in order to make us feel like we are healthy and we are well. My concern would be what happens if we lose the accessibility of technology for various reasons. What if we no longer have the resources to be able to pay for a smartphone subscription plan or internet, or what if internet access goes out for an extended amount of time? So I suppose my fear about techno-reliance would be what happens if, for reasons beyond our control, we lose the ability to use the technologies that we come to rely upon.
Well, I was reading your book. I was thinking about how there is this sort of thread that runs through dystopian science fiction, where people are these sort of good citizens who perform, you know, the sort of Brave New World kind of idea that we're all good medicalized kind of citizens who have 3 square meals a day and look after our mental health. Is there something about that sort of aspect of the good citizen that is disturbing to you in this?
So one of the things that I find a little worrisome are the ways that technologies and technological advances are being used and accepted in ways that manufacture data about us in ways that we're not necessarily consenting to. So I suppose it is a little bit of a Big Brother related type of fear related to surveillance and what happens to data about us when it is used in ways that we don't anticipate that it will be. So for example, in the book, I do discuss how Facebook creates data where it basically rates the mental healthiness of individual users based upon the content that they upload. Do they think people are at risk of harming themselves or others on a scale? If they think that they are at risk, they will try to potentially get emergency services to intervene. I also saw during the pandemic that school districts, because learning became predominantly online in North America, that there were new platforms, for example, one named Gaggle, which also analyzes uploaded data and information and does the same thing as Facebook, essentially. It looks for trigger words, and based upon algorithms that are grounded in machine learning technologies, tries to assess who is at imminent risk of harming themselves or others. So in that way, it's also manufacturing mental health related data. Now, my fear here is that because mental disorder and distress continue to be largely stigmatized, despite growing acceptance of anti-stigma campaigns, that we don't have control or knowledge about what happens with that information. So when Donald Trump says something like he did at a memorial following an El Paso shooting in Texas back when he was really wants us to harness the power of technology and the internet to stop crime before it happens and to weed out people with mental disorders and illnesses to prevent them from committing violent crimes. That is very worrisome to me because we do have this cultural tendency to conflate mental disorder and mental illness and mental distress with violence. And we have so much research to say that people who commit violent acts, for the most part, are not suffering from mental disorders or mental illnesses, and it perpetuates that negative stigma and correlation in popular belief. So I do have a lot of concerns about the technologization and datification of mental health care and mental health-related information.
What do you make of the actual claims of effectiveness of some of these technologies, in particular those that claim that they can assess mental state or mental wellness based on biological data?
So I think what you're pointing to now is that there are some technologies that use what are called passive sensing tools. So things like the way that a phone itself might be able to use the camera in its